For 94 days, a woman lived in a beige Volvo in the corner of a stop-and-shop parking lot in Newport, Rhode Island, and not one person in that town thought there was anything wrong with it. Her name was Delphine Marchetti Vance. She was 27 years old, and 18 months earlier, she'd been principal cellist of the New England Chamber Orchestra. She owned a house 4 miles away. Her father had left it to her in a will no court had ever contested. She just couldn't go inside it, because her stepmother had walked into a courthouse with 2 doctors' signatures and a story about a young woman who was becoming a danger to herself, and a judge who'd never met Delphine signed a temporary order in 11 minutes. Corinne Marchetti Vance never raised her voice. That's the part people don't understand. She didn't lock anyone in an attic. She brought casseroles. She cried in other people's kitchens. She called Delphine's best friend and sat there for 2 hours apologizing for the burden. And 6 days later, that friend gently suggested Delphine go home and make peace. She called the orchestra, just out of concern. She always got there first. Everywhere. And so a professional musician with a conservatory education and a trust fund she couldn't touch learned which nights the security guard skipped his rounds, learned that rain was safer than a clear sky, and learned the cruelest thing of all, which was that when she told strangers the truth out loud, in her own calm voice, it sounded exactly like something a crazy person would say. Corinne didn't need to silence her. She only needed to let her talk. Then, on a February night with dirty snow banked against the curbs, a knuckle rapped on the driver's side window at 3 a.m, and Delphine came up off the seat with the only weapon she had left in the world, the frog end of a cello bow, held out in a hand that didn't shake. The man standing in the snow was Raphael Castellan. He was 34. He was thin as wire, dark gray already coming in at his temples, wearing a coat that cost more than the car she was sleeping in. Around Providence, they called him the Quiet One, not because he was gentle, but because in 15 years nobody could recall ever hearing him raise his voice, and the men who'd worked the docks under his father knew exactly what that silence was worth. He was missing 2 joints off the little finger of his left hand. He'd never told anyone why, and when Delphine told him to stay back, he didn't move an inch. He just laid that ruined hand flat and open on the hood of her car, palm up, empty, and he said her music teacher's name. What she couldn't know yet was why a man like that had come at all, or that every Thursday for 15 years, he'd driven to a care facility in Cranston to sit for 3 hours with a woman who hadn't known his name since he was 22. He was the one man in Rhode Island who knew, from the inside, exactly what a mind coming apart actually looks like. And he'd looked at Delphine Marchetti Vance's file for 4 days straight, and what he saw wasn't a sick woman. It was a hunt. If this story is already getting under your skin, hit that like button and let us know you're here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because somebody out there is being told they're crazy tonight. And subscribe, because stories like this one deserve an ending, and we've got a long way to go. So now let's go back to that parking lot. 3 a.m, a cello bow, and an open hand, and the 7 minutes that changed everything. The old woman stepped out of the darkness between 2 delivery trucks, moving slowly, one hand gripping a side mirror to steady herself on the crusted snow, and when the sickly yellow floodlight touched her face, Delphine let out a breath that sounded as though someone had struck her in the chest. Ottilie Brennan Ward was 71 years old. She stood there in a wool coat worn thin at the elbows, the same coat Delphine had seen on hundreds of Saturday afternoons in the music room of her own home, and she was crying, without a sound, only tears running down both hollow cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "Mrs. Tilly," Delphine said, and her voice broke on the very first word, the same voice that only moments ago had been flat and sharp as a blade laid across a strange man's throat. "They told me you'd moved away, Miss," Mrs. Tilly said. "Miss, I'm here. I'm still here." The bow lowered. Not all the way. It lowered by no more than the width of a hand, the gesture of a woman who had spent 3 months learning that every gentle thing could be a trap, and Raphael Castellan, standing less than 2 steps away, noticed it and recorded it somewhere in his mind the way a man records the final number in a contract. He didn't move. His hand remained open on the hood, his palm empty, snow falling into it and melting into water, and he didn't pull it back. Delphine didn't climb down from the vehicle. She stayed seated on the edge of the seat, both feet still inside the cab, the door open only as wide as an unfinished decision, and she looked at the man for a very long time, And then she did something he hadn't prepared for at all. She laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just seen the ending of a story she had read too many times before. "Castellane," she said. "Do you think I don't read the newspapers? I sleep in a car, sir. I don't sleep under a rock. Everyone knows what that name means here in Providence. They print it in small letters at the bottom of page 3 every time someone disappears from the harbor." Mrs. Tilly tried to say something, a choked miss, but Delphine raised one hand and the old woman fell silent. "Please don't. You did this because you care about me, and I know that. But you don't understand what you've just done." She turned back to Raphael, and now she wasn't laughing anymore. "Do you understand what you've just done? For 3 months, I've been a woman falsely accused. That's all. A falsely accused woman still has somewhere to stand, sir, even if that place is the driver's seat in a supermarket parking lot. People can still look at me and think, maybe that girl is telling the truth. But after tonight, if anyone sees you standing here, then, what am I? I'm a madwoman taken in by a criminal organization. I'm a newspaper headline. Do you know how much my stepmother would pay to own this night? She'd pay everything she has. And you've just handed it to her for free. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the snow." She stopped. Her breath rose white into the air and dissolved. "I don't know who you are," he answered very softly, without a moment's hesitation. "That's all right. I know who you are." She heard those words and believed she understood them. A file. Men like him kept files on everyone. She let the words pass and didn't ask what he meant, and many months later, when she finally understood what that sentence had truly meant, she would remember forever that she had stood only one unasked question away from the truth. But for now, she simply continued. "So go home. Thank you for coming. I mean that, thank you. You're the first person in 3 months who's been willing to come near this car without wearing pity on his face. But you're the finest gift I've ever given her, and I have nothing left to give anyone." And then something happened that Mrs. Tilly, standing nearby, would recount for the rest of her life, though no one would ever believe her. Raphael Castellane didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't utter any of the things a powerful man usually says when someone who has nothing tells him that he's wrong. He stood motionless in the snow, and there was something on his face that Providence had never seen and would never believe could be real. And it was this. He was thinking. For 15 years, he had survived by reading other people faster than they could read him, and a gaunt woman sitting inside a broken vehicle had just read him completely in less than 2 minutes. And she had read him correctly. Every word of him. He looked at the bow in her hand, its wooden frog still pointing outward, and he thought of men he had met, who held things far more dangerous than that, yet whose hands had trembled more than hers. Then he said, "You're right." Mrs. Tilly looked up. "I came here with a plan," he said. "My plan was bad. You've just shown me exactly why it was bad, and I have nothing to argue against. So I'm not taking you anywhere. I'll stand right here until you tell me to leave." He paused, and the next sentence left his mouth more slowly than any of the others, because in all his adult life, he had never once said it to anyone. "Then tell me what I should do." 4 days before that night, in a second-floor room of an unmarked building on Federal Hill, a 71-year-old woman sat down in the chair usually reserved for debtors and enemies, and she placed her handbag on her lap as though it were a small animal that needed to be kept warm. Emmett Straub stood by the door and never took his eyes off her, because that was his job, and because in 10 years of doing this work, he had never seen anyone sit in that chair without at least one bead of sweat at the temple. Mrs. Tilly had none. She was only cold. Raphael Castellane sat behind the desk without speaking, letting silence do its work as it always did, and he waited for her to begin in one of the 3 ways everyone began: pleading, bargaining, or threatening. She chose none of them. She said, "I know you're going to ask why I came to you. So I'll tell you now and save us both some time." Raphael didn't answer. "People tell me you're the most feared man in this state. That isn't why I came. I'm not looking for a frightening man, Mr. Castellane. I'm looking for the young man I once saw kneeling on the steps of St. Bartholomew Church. There was a clock hanging on the wall, and Emmett would later say that he could hear it clearly, a sound he had never once noticed in all the 10 years it had been there. I played the organ there," Mrs. Tilly said, 15 years ago. That morning, I was practicing for the afternoon service when there was a noise outside, and everyone in the church ran out and then ran away. The priest, the people kneeling in the front pews, every one of them. because they knew what had just happened, and they knew that staying meant becoming a witness, and being a witness in this city carries a price. I was already old. I couldn't run fast enough. I stayed on the organ bench, and from there I saw everything. Raphael didn't move. I saw a young man come running. He was about 19. He dropped to his knees on the steps, and he didn't scream, didn't call for anyone, didn't strike the ground with his fists the way people do in movies. He only took off his coat and laid it over his father, carefully, as though he were afraid the man might be cold. Then he sat there. He sat there for a very long time, Mr. Castellane, so long that I began to think perhaps he had forgotten the rest of the world still existed. And when the police cars arrived, he stood up and told them he hadn't seen anything. He said it in a very calm voice. 19 years old, she looked directly at him. I was the only person left inside the church that day. I've never told anyone this story. Not in 15 years. Raphael Castellane raised a hand to his left wrist, removed his watch, and placed it face up on the desk. The glass turned toward the ceiling. Emmett Straub, standing by the door, watched him do it, and suddenly understood that this meeting wouldn't end in 5 minutes like all the others. Tell me, Raphael said. From the beginning, and she did. She spoke for more than an hour without crying, without missing a single beat, in the voice of a woman who had taught music all her life and knew exactly how slowly a story must be told for people to truly hear it. And when she finished, Raphael asked her only one question. You said the girl lost her home in the fall. It's February now. Why did you wait until now? Mrs. Tilly looked down at the handbag in her lap. Then she said, without lifting her head, Do you know her instrument was sold at a charity auction? They took photographs. People even praised that woman for being generous, and she went on talking about the auction, and Raphael let her speak, and he didn't ask the question again. But he had heard it. He had heard the emptiness where an answer should have been, the way a person stepped aside, as though avoiding a puddle they knew was deep, and he stored it somewhere in his mind, beside all the other things whose time had not yet come. After she left, he called Emmett into the room, and he did what 15 years of instinct told him to do. Beginning the next morning, a large man sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room of Dr. Ansel Pryor's clinic, reading a fishing magazine. He had no appointment. He asked no questions. He sat there from opening until closing, day after day, turning the pages one at a time, and when the receptionist asked what he needed, he smiled with great kindness and said that he was waiting. On the 4th day, after he had gone, an ivory condolence card remained on the reception counter, the kind people send when there has been a death in the family. Nothing was written inside it. There was nothing to report to the police. Not a single sentence that could be read aloud in court. But that evening, Dr. Ansel Pryor didn't go home. He drove out of the city, 40 minutes toward Newport, and rang the bell at a gate he should never have rung. She didn't go to his house. That was the first thing he told her when she asked him that night, in the snow, and he said it before she had even finished the question, because he had spent the entire 7 minutes standing there with his palm open on the hood thinking about it. If you sleep under my roof, then everything you say afterward will be worth nothing, he said. People will say you're speaking under my direction, so you'll stay at my lawyer's home, and I won't have a key, and if anyone asks, the answer will be the truth. Josephine Okonkwo Reyes was 38 years old, barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, and the only person in Providence who dared interrupt Raphael Castellane in the middle of a sentence. She opened the door at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning, looked at the woman standing in the hallway, and didn't ask a single question. She only said, "The room on the right. I leave the hallway light on all night. Turn it off yourself if you want it off. Don't ask me." The next morning, while Delphine was still asleep, 2 men arrived carrying a toolbox, and they removed every lock on the outside of every interior door in the apartment. Not the lock on the front door. Only the locks that could be turned from the other side. Joe asked who had told them to do it, and they said they weren't allowed to answer, and Joe stared at the toolbox for a long time before telling them to finish the job. Raphael never mentioned it. Delphine never asked about it either. She simply found herself living in a home where no door could lock her in from the other side, and it took her weeks to understand why she could breathe there. She slept on the floor. On the first night, Joe found her lying on the rug beside the bed, curled beneath a blanket, and Delphine apologized in the voice of someone apologizing for existing, then explained that the bed was too soft, that her back had grown accustomed to a reclining driver's seat, and now anything gentle made her feel as though she were falling. She startled when the microwave beeped. She startled when the refrigerator came on. She couldn't eat while anyone was watching, so Jo learned to turn her back and read case files while the food cooled behind her, saying nothing, and that was how it went for days. On the third night, Raphael came. He sat in the armchair in the living room, far from the door to her room, because Jo had told him to sit there. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, Delphine came out and stood in the doorway, her right hand raised to her left collarbone, pressing against some spot there, a small gesture he would see hundreds of times before he finally understood what it meant. She said, "May I ask you something?" "Yes." "Am I speaking clearly?" He didn't answer at once, and in those 2 seconds, he saw her begin to tremble. "You'll tell me the truth if I'm not, won't you? Promise me. Don't soothe me. I can bear the truth. I can't bear people soothing me anymore." Raphael Castellan sat straighter in the darkness. "You're speaking clearly," he said. "You're always clear. And you can ask me 100 times a day, and all 100 times I'll give you exactly the same answer, until the part of you that learned to doubt itself forgets how to do it. There's no hurry. We have all the time in the world." She stood there for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the doorframe, and she began to speak, and he didn't interrupt her once. She told him about her mother. Marguerite Vance played the cello, and she became ill, and she remained ill for many years, and they treated her with everything available in those days, and then she died. Delphine was 9 years old. She had been at school. She remembered being collected early and no one telling her why, and she remembered arriving home to find the house full of adults she didn't know, standing so closely together that they filled the upstairs hallway. She wasn't allowed into the room. That was everything she remembered about that day, a hallway filled with the backs of grown people, and not one of them telling her anything. "I've spent 18 years reconstructing what happened," she said, "from scraps I picked up along the way, because no one was willing to tell me, and then, years later, when Corinne entered that house, she never spoke a single cruel word. She would only say very softly to the guests while pouring tea, 'The girl is more like her mother than she realizes.' Anyone who knew Marguerite can see it, and everyone would nod, every one of them." Delphine continued, her voice flat and without rise or fall, the voice people use when reading a list. Her father had died 18 months earlier, and that night he had called her 3 times, but she had been at a dress rehearsal and hadn't answered. Then she moved on to something else. Raphael didn't ask her to go back. He only sat in the darkness and listened until the sky outside the windows began to turn gray, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had never met anyone from whom so much had been taken, who could still sit with her back so straight. The only thing Delphine took with her when she left the car was a small plastic box, the kind of rosin case every string musician keeps inside an instrument bag, and she held it in her palm all the way to Joe's home as though she were carrying a bird. That morning, she placed it on the kitchen table and opened the lid. There was no rosin inside. There was an old phone with a crack running diagonally across the screen, and a charging cord wrapped around it several times. "I need you to understand something first," she said to Joe. "I didn't make these recordings to accuse her. I never thought about doing that, not even once." Joe sat down. "I recorded them because one morning she said something to me, and that afternoon she told me she had never said it, and she said it with such concern in her voice that I stood there in the kitchen and didn't know which one of us was awake. Then it happened again. Then it happened again. And after a while I stopped trusting my own memory. Do you understand? Not that I trusted it less, but that I didn't trust it at all anymore. So I turned on the recorder, so that at night I could sit alone and listen again and tell myself, 'There, you didn't imagine it. It was real. It really happened.'" She pushed the box across the table. "I didn't make it for a courtroom. I made it for myself." Joe Okonkwo Reyes picked up the phone and checked the storage, and she remained silent for a long time. There were 400 hours on it. No index, no markers. Delphine had left the recorder running continuously for months, hidden inside her instrument bag, inside a drawer, behind stacks of sheet music, and most of what it had captured was the sound of dishes, the television in the next room, rain, and stretches of silence that lasted 10 minutes or more. Joe listened to all of it, 9 days. She and 2 assistants divided the recordings among themselves, wearing headphones, rewinding and replaying them, and on the 9th day, she came out of her office with red eyes, sat down across from Delphine, and spoke plainly, because she was the kind of person who didn't know how to speak any other way. I can't use it. Delphine didn't move. There are 3 reasons, and none of them can be fixed. First, in the most important section, she's speaking on the telephone in the living room with the call on speaker, while you're in the next room. You weren't part of that call. In this state, it's legal to record a conversation when you're present. It isn't legal to record a call when you aren't one of the parties. The court won't admit it, and worse, her lawyer will use the fact that you made the recording to portray you as a secretive woman who was spying on other people inside her own home. You'd be handing them a weapon. Second, 400 hours without any independently verified timestamps will make them ask who cut it, who edited it, and who can guarantee its authenticity. And third, Joe stopped. That passage is vague. She says the girl only needs to look tired enough on the day of the hearing. Leave that part to me. When you hear it, the meaning is clear to you. When I hear it, the meaning is clear to me. But a good lawyer will stand up and say, she was only a stepmother concerned about her child's health before a stressful proceeding. And he'll finish saying it in less than half a minute, and everyone in the courtroom will nod. Delphine sat motionless. Outside the window, a snowplow passed by. Then Joe leaned forward, and she did something she had never done with a client in her entire career. She took Delphine's hand. But listen to me now. Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I can't use it in court. But these 400 hours prove something, and no judge has the authority to rule on what that means. They prove that you never imagined any of it. Not one word. For months, people told you there was something wrong with your mind, and you sat alone at night searching for proof, not to use against anyone, but only to prove to yourself that you were still sane. And you were right. You were right from beginning to end. Not for the judge, Delphine. For you, and Delphine Marchetti Vance, who hadn't cried when she was taken from her own home in broad daylight, who hadn't cried throughout that entire winter, inside the car, who had pointed a bow at a man in Providence without a tremor in her hand, collapsed onto the kitchen table in a stranger's home, and wept like a child. And Joe sat there in silence and said nothing more and simply let her cry until there was nothing left. That night, Joe didn't sleep. She opened the files again, not to search for any particular statement, but to listen for something else. People's names, dates, numbers Corinne had let slip when she believed only 4 walls could hear her. And near dawn, Joe removed her headphones, sat up straight, and realized that for 9 days she had been holding the wrong thing. It wasn't evidence. It was a map Joe discovered that Delphine could eat when she was outdoors, and that was how the walks began. No one discussed it. Raphael simply appeared one afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee, and didn't say why he had come, and they walked along the cliff road in Newport, where the February wind blew in from the open water, scraping against the skin like sandpaper, and the sea below was the color of lead, and there wasn't another person anywhere along the long stretch of road, and in the middle of all that emptiness, Delphine could breathe. He slowed his pace to match hers. He didn't ask anything. Later, she would understand that this was precisely why she told him, that throughout that entire winter, he was the only person who never asked her a single question. She told him about Beatrix and Saldo. They had known each other since their first year at the conservatory, sitting beside one another in rehearsal rooms, sharing a sandwich at midnight before examinations. And Beatrix was the first person Delphine called when the door of her own home closed behind her. Beatrix said she would come immediately, and she truly did. For the first 6 weeks, Delphine slept in her friend's living room on a sofa that was too short, and she remembered thinking, with a naivety that hurt her now whenever she looked back on it, that at least she still had one person. Then Corinne came. She didn't call ahead. She rang the doorbell one afternoon while Delphine was out, and she brought a pie, the kind of apple pie people bring to neighbors who have just moved in. She sat in Beatrix's kitchen for 2 hours. She cried. That was the part Delphine had to stop in the wind to explain clearly, because she knew anyone listening would imagine a threat, and there had been no threat at all. She apologized, Delphine said. She sat there and apologized to Beatrix. She said she felt terribly guilty for allowing this burden to fall onto the shoulders of a young woman who had no responsibility for any of it. She said she had done everything she could, found the best doctors, spent countless nights without sleep, and failed, and now Beatrix was the one who had to carry it. She asked Beatrix whether she was sleeping. She asked whether she was tired, she asked in the voice of a woman being torn apart by concern. Delphine pulled her collar higher. Do you know where the poison was? She didn't say a single cruel thing about me. Not one. She only sat there looking exhausted and kind, and she let Beatrix invent the rest for herself. 6 days later, Beatrix sat down on the edge of the sofa one morning and took Delphine's hand. She didn't throw her out. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke very gently, in the tone people use when suggesting something wholesome and good, saying that perhaps Delphine should go home and make peace with her, that family was still family, that everything would be easier if she allowed people to help her. And Delphine sat there on that sofa that was too short, looking into the face of her oldest friend, and she saw it, the thing that had settled behind Beatrix's eyes over those 6 days, something that looked gentle and patient and impossible to argue with. She stood up. She folded the blanket. She said thank you, walked out the door, and never returned. No one threw me out, she told Raphael. That's the part I need you to understand. No one did anything to me. Beatrix was still a good person, and she's a good person to this day. She had simply been told a story before I had the chance to tell mine. I left on my own. I folded the blanket myself, and I walked out the door myself. That was how everything in my life happened throughout that year. No one ever laid a hand on me. Raphael walked beside her without speaking, and he was making a calculation in his mind, the calculation she didn't need to put into words for him. The woman had rung Beatrix's doorbell before Delphine had even thought of asking anyone for help. She had called the orchestra before anyone had the chance to invite Delphine to play again. She had sat in other people's kitchens before Delphine could cross their thresholds. He looked out toward the sea and thought about a woman who had stayed one step ahead of her stepdaughter, at every turn for months, patient, gentle, silent, and he felt something inside him begin to heat slowly like coals inside a furnace. Was there anyone else? He asked. Did you try anyone else? Delphine didn't answer at once. Then she said, her voice flat, I tried the police station once, only once. She kept walking. She didn't tell that story to anyone, not even him, and she wouldn't tell it until much later. There was a particular morning she shared with him just once, never to speak of it again. The sky had been clear that day, which meant the night had been a bad one, and she was sitting in the driver's seat with the notebook on her lap when someone tapped gently on the glass. A woman about her mother's age stood outside wearing a red coat, her silver hair neatly arranged, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression Delphine would remember for the rest of her life, because there wasn't the slightest trace of cruelty in it. She lowered the window. The woman handed one of the cups inside. She said, Sweetheart, you've been sitting here for several days. I see you every morning on my way to work. She asked whether Delphine was all right. She asked whether there was anyone at home she could call, whether she had any family, whether there was someone the woman could contact for her. And Delphine, who had remained silent for so many days that her throat felt raw when she tried to make a sound, took the hot coffee in both hands and began to tell the truth. She spoke slowly. She spoke with great clarity, carefully and in order, because she had rehearsed this story inside her mind hundreds of times and knew precisely where she needed to begin. She said, my stepmother. She said the court. She said 2 doctors, and a temporary order, and my father's house 4 miles from here, which I'm not allowed to enter. She managed perhaps 3 sentences, and then she saw it. It began at the corners of the woman's eyes, something very small, and then it spread downward to her mouth, and it wasn't contempt. And that was the part Delphine would never forget, because if it had been contempt, she could have argued against it. It was pity. The woman's face softened. She touched the frame of the car door, and she said, in the voice people use with the sick, a voice gentle and slow and utterly impossible to argue with, It's all right, sweetheart. It's all right. She told Delphine to drink the coffee and get warm. She told her to keep herself warm. Then she left. She went to work, and she was a good person. And that evening she would go home and perhaps tell her husband that there was a poor young woman out in the parking lot. Delphine remained there alone, holding the hot coffee in both hands, watching the steam rise, and she understood what that entire winter had been trying to teach her. The truth, when spoken aloud, sounded exactly like the words of a madwoman. Not because she told it badly, she told it perfectly. It was precisely because it was perfect, because it was clear and orderly and filled with details, that it sounded even more like madness. Corinne had never needed to silence her. She only needed to let her speak. From that morning until the night Someone tapped on her car window for the second time. Delphine Marchetti Vance didn't tell her story to another soul. Not because she was afraid, because she understood. And that silence was something she chose for herself, and it was the most costly thing the other woman had taken from her. Raphael listened to the entire story one afternoon on the cliff road, and he said nothing. 2 days later, he came to the apartment carrying something in his hands. He didn't say what it was, where it had come from, or why he had brought it. He only stood it in the corner of the room beside the window, where the morning sunlight fell, then sat down in the armchair as he always did and began talking about the weather. A cello. For 3 days, Delphine didn't touch it. She walked past it many times each day. She stood in the kitchen and looked at it through the doorway. She raised her hand to her left collarbone and pressed the spot where, for 20 years, a thick callus had formed because the instrument rested there every day. And she realized that it was softening, fading, disappearing, and she stood there in a stranger's kitchen with a cold understanding traveling down her spine, that her body was quietly erasing the last evidence of who she had once been. On the 4th day, Raphael was sitting in the living room, and Joe sat across from him with a stack of case files, when a sound came through the wall. One note, only a single note, held for a long time, slightly out of tune, trembling at the end. Then silence, then the sound of crying. Joe stood up to go inside, and Raphael raised one hand, and she sat down again. They remained there, 2 grown people sitting silently in a room, listening to a woman weep behind the wall, and neither of them went in. That evening, Delphine came out with swollen eyes, and she looked at him for a long time before asking, "Where did you get it?" Raphael Castellan stood, put on his coat, and wished her good night. There were things in Providence that didn't require a telephone call. They simply appeared. The next morning, when Raphael came downstairs, a black car was parked across the street with its rear door already open, and Emmett Straub stood on the sidewalk looking at it without saying a word, because they both knew who the car belonged to, and they both knew that it wasn't something a man refused. Gazar Sarkeesian was 66 years old. He sat in the far corner, a small old man wearing a turtleneck sweater, holding a paper bag filled with still warm bagels, and when Raphael got inside, he offered him the bag before he even said hello, "Eat." "You're too thin. If your mother could see you now, she'd cry." Then he said, "Forgive me. I forgot." The car moved slowly along the waterfront. Emmett sat in the front beside the driver, his eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield, and no one told him to get out, and that too was a message. Sarkeesian said nothing for a long while. He looked through the window at the cranes and the gray water, like a man quietly taking in the view. "Do you know what I like about our arrangement?" he finally said. "It has only one condition. Just one. People think these things have to be complicated, that there must be papers and lawyers. There don't. One condition. Don't let Washington remember that this city exists. It's been 11 years. 11 years without anyone shooting anyone, without anyone making the newspapers, without anyone having to go anywhere. Do you know what 11 peaceful years are worth to a man my age?" He turned toward Raphael. "And now there's a woman who plays music. There's a court case. There are reporters. There's a young prosecutor who needs a name for the file that will earn him his promotion. And the finest name in this state to put on that file is Castellan." Raphael didn't answer. "I didn't come to threaten you," Sarkeesian said, and the frightening thing was that he meant it. There wasn't a grain of menace in his voice. It was only tired and sincere, like the voice of an uncle speaking to his nephew in the kitchen. "I care about you. I've known you since you weren't tall enough to reach a doorknob. I sat in the 3rd pew at your father's funeral. Do you remember? No, you don't. You didn't look at anyone that day." He folded the paper bag closed, carefully creasing the edge. "Your father died over one street, Raphael, 3 blocks, a few bakeries, a laundromat. People told him to sell it, and he said no. And he died on the steps of a church like a fool. And do you know what I think? I think he was the best man I ever knew. That's exactly what I think. Good men die, my boy. That isn't a curse, it's arithmetic. I don't judge him, I don't judge you." The car turned. "I'll ask you only one question, and then I'll leave you alone. Are you planning to die for a woman you've known for 6 weeks? Fine. Men have died for far more foolish things. I've seen it. But there are 300 mouths that eat because of you, Raphael. 300. Women, children, old men who can't do anything anymore but still receive an envelope every month. They don't know the musician's name. They don't know whether she's sane or insane. They only know whether there will be rice next month, or whether there won't. He rested one hand on his knee. Do they get a vote? In the front seat, Emmett Straub didn't turn around. He kept looking straight through the windshield, and something passed across his face very quickly, and then it was gone, and he continued staring ahead. The car stopped exactly where it had picked them up. Sarkeesian patted Raphael's arm lightly, the way an uncle might pat his nephew's shoulder, and he said, "Give my warmest regards to your mother. Tell her I still remember her, even if she cannot say the same." He laughed softly, and it was that laugh that remained. Raphael Castellane stepped out of the car. He walked to his own vehicle, opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine. He sat there. Emmett stood about 20 paces away with his hands in his pockets, and through the snow-streaked glass, he watched the man he had followed for 10 years sit motionless inside a car with its engine off, not striking the steering wheel, not cursing, not calling anyone, only sitting there with both hands resting on his thighs and his eyes fixed ahead. The air grew colder. The windows began to fog. Emmett took out his phone and then put it away again. He didn't dare call. Never in 10 years had he seen his boss remain silent for so long, and never had he been so afraid. And he didn't know what he was afraid of. Within those 400 hours, there was one evening when Corinne spoke to someone about a grant, and she mentioned a name, and that name meant nothing to anyone except a lawyer searching for a place to dig. Joe Okonkwo Reyes dug there. The charitable foundation bearing the Marchetti Vance family name was a respectable organization, with a governing board, audits, and a fundraising gala every fall attended by half of Newport, and in its public records, clean stamped and fully disclosed, there were 3 payments to a private clinic in Providence listed as grants for clinical research. 3 payments. There was nothing illegal about any one of them. Joe printed those 3 sheets of paper and placed them side by side on the table, then took out the court records and laid them beside them, and she stared at them for a very long time. And she saw what no auditor in the world could ever have seen by examining each page separately. The first payment had been transferred during the exact week Corinne filed her initial petition. The second had been transferred during the exact week the 2 medical certificates were signed. The third had been transferred 3 days before she filed to make the order permanent. Viewed separately, each page was an act of kindness. Placed side by side, they were an invoice. Dr. Ansel Pryor said nothing at all. Joe sent him a formal request for an interview, and within 48 hours he had retained a lawyer from Boston. And that lawyer replied with 3 polite lines, stating that his client was invoking his right against self-incrimination and wouldn't answer any questions, verbally or in writing, under any circumstances. He was 58 years old. He had been given 48 hours to understand that silence was cheaper than every alternative, and he would remain silent until he died. So Joe went looking for the other man. Tobias Wren was 34 years old and worked in a clinic that rented the 2nd floor of a building with a sandwich shop on the ground floor. On his desk was a photograph of a laughing baby and a student loan statement he didn't bother putting away because hiding it wouldn't change anything. He was the 2nd man who had signed the certificate declaring Delphine Marchetti Vance incompetent. He had met with her for exactly 22 minutes. Joe sat down across from him and didn't threaten him. She didn't mention anyone, didn't speak a single name, didn't say one sentence that could be transcribed and presented in court. She only asked whether he remembered that examination, and he said yes, of course he did. She asked how long it had lasted. He said he couldn't remember exactly. She opened her briefcase, took out the records, and read aloud the number written in his own paperwork. Then she placed a photograph on the desk. He looked down. Neither of them spoke. Downstairs, the meat slicer in the sandwich shop hummed steadily. Tobias Wren remained still for a very long time, so long that Joe began to think she had miscalculated, and then he asked a question, and his voice sounded nothing like the voice of the man who had invited her to sit down. How long was she in there? Joe told him the number. He said nothing. He didn't push the photograph away. He left it lying there on the desk between them, and he looked at it, and Joe understood that this was the moment upon which the entire case turned. Not a payment, not a signature, but a man finally willing to look. I had 22 minutes, he said, and she had 94 days. He raised a hand to his face. I read the file before she came in. Do you understand? I read it first. There was a report from another doctor, someone older than I was, someone more respected than I was. and that report had already told me what was wrong with her. So I sat there, and I didn't examine her. I checked whether she matched what I had already read. Those are two different things, Miss Okonkwo Reyes. I know they're different. They taught me that in medical school, and I still remember it. He looked at the photograph. She told me. She told me very calmly that someone was doing this to her, and I wrote in her record that the patient displayed persecutory delusions. I wrote that sentence with my own hand. In 22 minutes, Jo said nothing. She had learned from Rafael Castellan, though she would never admit it, that there were moments when silence did better work than any words could. I'll testify, Ren said. He didn't ask how she intended to protect him. He didn't ask what would happen to his medical license, to his debt, or to the baby in the photograph on his desk. He only said, "Could you leave this photograph with me?" It was a Thursday, and he didn't explain anything. He only asked whether she wanted to come with him, and she said yes before she had time to ask where they were going. The nursing home in Cranston smelled like every nursing home in the world, of floor cleaner and soup. And at the end of the second-floor hallway there was a room overlooking the parking lot, and inside that room sat a woman beside the window with a wool blanket across her lap. Consolata Castellan was 71 years old. She looked at Raphael as he entered, and smiled with great politeness, the kind of smile one gives a kind stranger. And she said, "Hello, young man?" He said, "Hello, mother." He said it in such an ordinary voice that Delphine had to turn away. Then Consolata saw Delphine, and her face brightened, and she leaned forward and asked with hope in her voice, "Are you the music teacher?" Delphine stood there. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. And then she said, "Yes, Mom." At the end of the hallway stood an old upright piano, its wooden surface scratched, and it had been out of tune for so long that no one bothered mentioning it anymore. Delphine sat down before it. She placed both hands on the keys and felt what had happened to them during that winter, the way the ring finger of her left hand kept trying to curl into her palm of its own accord, and she knew what was about to happen. She played anyway. It was bad. It was bad in the way that made people want to look elsewhere. Wrong notes, broken rhythm, one musical phrase split in two because her finger wouldn't obey her, and the piano itself was out of tune, and still she continued, her face burning red, and she didn't stop. Consolata Castellan began to cry, not from sadness. She sat in her wheelchair with both hands resting on the blanket, tears running down her face while she smiled, laughing and crying at once like a child who had been given a gift. And she said something in Italian that no one in the hallway understood, and then she said, "More, please. Play more, Miss." Raphael stood in the doorway. Later, when they stepped into the hallway, he spoke to Delphine, and he spoke very slowly. 6 years ago, there was a charity concert here, in this exact place. Your orchestra sent a small group, probably because someone made them come, probably because no one wanted to. The principal cellist was a 21-year-old woman. Delphine turned to look at him. My mother could still speak then. She sat in the front row and cried through the entire performance, the entire thing. Afterward, she kept asking me to bring her back to hear them again. She asked when they would return. She asked all through that year. Those were the most beautiful 3 hours she had that entire year, and I tried to buy them back. I had money. I called people. I offered to pay any price if they would come again. They thanked me very politely and never came. He looked down the hallway. I stood at the back of the room that day. I always stand at the back of the room. I didn't come near you. I didn't say a word to you. I didn't thank you. I only remembered. Delphine stood motionless for a long time. Then she said, her voice so quiet it was almost impossible to hear, "I don't remember any of it. I played hundreds of concerts like that. Hundreds. I'm sorry. I truly don't." "I know," he said. "You had no reason to remember. That's exactly what I'm trying to tell you. You gave my mother the most beautiful 3 hours of her entire year. And you didn't even know you had done it. You walked out of this place and forgot about it before that week was over. That is who you are, Delphine. That is who you are when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, when it means nothing to you at all." He stopped, and they called that person ill. Inside the room, Consolata was singing. She sang badly, off-key, singing a song whose name no one remembered anymore, and she clapped her hands against the blanket to a rhythm that belonged only to her. Raphael Castellan stood in the doorway and looked inside at those two women, one whose mind had truly left her, and one whom the entire world had declared in a single voice had lost hers. And he raised one hand to the doorframe to steady himself, and he broke, without a sound, only the shoulders of a very tall man collapsing inward, his head bowed, and he stood that way while his mother sang. Delphine looked at him, and she understood. He didn't believe her because he cared for her. He believed her because he was the only man in that state who had spent 15 years sitting beside a mind that was truly dissolving every Thursday, and he knew what it looked like from the inside, and he knew it didn't look like her. He wasn't guessing. He was bearing witness. After the day in Cranston, Joe scheduled an examination for Delphine's hand, and the doctor was a woman in her 50s who specialized in musicians. And she asked Delphine to play, and she watched, and she asked her to play again, and then she set down her pen. It was called focal dystonia. The finger curled inward on its own when Delphine played, not because she wanted it to, not because she was weak, but because some pathway in her brain had learned the wrong pattern and now kept sending that wrong command again and again. No one could prove the cause, but the doctor spoke plainly about what was commonly seen. Months of living under extreme stress, combined with abruptly stopping practice after 20 years of playing every day. "You can play again," she said. "You'll never play the way you did before." Delphine asked whether it could be treated, and the doctor said there were many approaches. Injections, retraining from the beginning. Some people improved greatly, some didn't, and no one could promise anything. Then she looked at Delphine and said the sentence Delphine would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I'm very sorry. No one struck your hand. There's nothing to sue over. You simply lived in fear for too long." Delphine didn't cry. She thanked the doctor, thanked her twice, asked whether there was anything she needed to pay, and then walked out. She got into the car. Raphael sat beside her and didn't start the engine. Outside, someone was scraping snow from a windshield, the plastic dragging steadily across the glass. "I don't need you to fix this," she said. "You can't. The court can't. There's no one to accuse, no single act to point at." She only talked. Delphine looked outside. "I only need you not to tell me that everything will be all right," and he didn't. He sat there with her in the car without starting the engine until every window had fogged over. That evening, Mrs. Tilley came to his office without warning. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, holding her handbags, and said, "I have to tell you something before the hearing, because her lawyer will find it, and I don't want you to hear it from someone else." She hadn't come forward after Delphine lost her home. She had known since the 3rd month, from the day she heard that the orchestra had stopped calling Delphine. She had known immediately. She had taught the girl since she was 6 years old. She knew exactly what was happening and who was doing it, and she had understood everything in a single afternoon. And she had waited 11 months. "She gave me money," Mrs. Tilley said. "She called it a thank you for all my years of service. I'm 71 years old, Mr. Castellane. I live on a pension and the money I earn teaching music, and she handed me an envelope, and I took it. I took it with both hands and thanked her, and every month, I told myself I would do something the following month, next month." Then the month after that, Raphael said nothing. "Do you know why I finally came? It wasn't because I became brave. The money ran out. I waited until the girl had nothing left to lose, and only then did I find the courage." Mrs. Tilley stood there and didn't cry, and that was the worst part. Delphine heard the truth the following morning from the old woman herself, in Joe's kitchen. When Mrs. Tilley finished, she stood to leave because she didn't believe she was allowed to remain, and Delphine called her name. Then she walked around the table and embraced the 71-year-old woman, and she said, "Mrs. Tilley, an entire city did nothing. You were the only person who finally came. You came late, but you came." And Mrs. Tilley broke in too inside her arms and wept the way old people weep, without beauty or restraint, and Delphine held her and didn't let go. That afternoon on the cliff road, Raphael drew his line. He told her that she depended on him, that she was healing, that the entire state knew what kind of man he was, that he had only happened to stand on the right side once in his life, and that he wouldn't take advantage of someone's weakest moment to claim something she might not give him once she was strong again. Delphine listened to every word. Then she reached out and took his left hand, the hand he always kept inside his pocket, and pulled it out into the wind. He went rigid. She didn't let go. "You think that when I'm healed, I'll see you more clearly and be grateful you never said a word. Raphael, I already see you clearly, more clearly than you see yourself. This isn't a flaw I'm generously overlooking. It's you. It's the person who came to that parking lot at 3 o'clock in the morning." She lowered his hand and stepped back. giving him exactly the distance he had just asked for. So keep your boundary. I can wait. But don't mistake me for someone who's waiting to decide. I decided inside that car. I'm only waiting for you to become brave enough to hear it. The call was made at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and the caller's voice trembled in exactly the way every dispatcher recognized as the voice of someone who was genuinely afraid. She said, "My husband's daughter just sent me a message," she said. "I have the message here. I'll read it to you." And she read it. It was a real message, sent from a real number, written during the worst night of Delphine Marchetti Vance's life, 14 months earlier. Corinne had kept it for 14 months. She hadn't changed a single word. She had only left out the date. 18 minutes later, there was a knock on the apartment door. 2 people wearing the blue jackets of a psychiatric emergency response unit stood there, with a Providence police officer half a step behind them. They had paperwork. They were following the exact procedure the state had written to save people. Not one of those 3 people was doing anything wrong. Jo Okonkwo Reyes opened the door, wearing pajamas and glasses, and she planted herself directly in the middle of the doorway. She didn't raise her voice. She asked to see the papers. She demanded time to read every line carefully. She asked for the name of the physician on duty who had authorized the order and demanded that he be called immediately. She asked whether the date of the message had been verified, and when they told her that wasn't within their authority, she said, "Yes, I know. I'm only making a record that I asked and that you answered in that way." She did the only thing the law allowed her to do, the thing every good lawyer understood. She couldn't stop them. She could only force them to move slowly. 7 minutes. Behind her, in the kitchen, Delphine had backed into the corner, between the refrigerator and the table. For 4 seconds she became the woman she had been in November again. The entire winter that had passed, the cello in the corner, the walks beside the sea, all of it was erased in 4 seconds, and her hand reached blindly behind her and seized the nearest thing, and that thing was a wooden spoon lying inside a mixing bowl. She stood there, 27 years old, in a stranger's kitchen, holding a wooden spoon. No one moved toward her. Raphael arrived in the 7th minute. He didn't push anyone aside. He stopped in the hallway a few steps from the door, looked inside, and saw her standing in the corner of the kitchen. Then he spoke very quietly, not to the people in blue. Who told her that Delphine was here? No one answered. But someone was standing at the far end of the hallway, someone who had been there before Raphael arrived, and that person didn't leave. Emmett Straub didn't deny it. That was what Raphael would remember forever. He didn't deny it for even a second. He only stood there with his arms hanging at his sides and said in a hoarse voice, "I did. I called her lawyer yesterday afternoon." Then he said the rest, speaking quickly, speaking like a man who had rehearsed every word inside his head for an entire day. He had seen Sarkeesian step out of the car. He had watched his boss sit inside a vehicle with the engine off until every window had fogged over. Night after night, he had counted the 300 mouths. The old women on Federal Hill who received an envelope every month, the children who didn't know anyone's name. He had thought that if the woman were taken away, Raphael would come to his senses, and everyone would live, and only one person would have to pay the price. He had weighed it. He had calculated it. One person in exchange for 300. He had believed it was the right arithmetic. Raphael Castellan didn't move. He looked at the man who had walked beside him for 10 years, who had driven him, who had stood outside his mother's door every Thursday in the rain, and he looked at him for a very long time, and there wasn't a sound in the hallway. Then he said, "Do you know that everyone thought exactly the way you did, Em?" Emmett didn't lift his head. The police thought that way. Her closest friend thought that way. Sitting in her own kitchen and thinking exactly what you just thought. That doctor thought that way in 22 minutes. The woman who carried coffee into the parking lot thought that way and then went to work. 94 days, Emmett. 94 days. And this entire city made the same calculation you made, that she was a reasonable price to pay for something larger. Not one of them was a bad person. Neither are you. That's the part I can't understand. He turned his head away. Get out of here. Don't make me say it again. Emmett Straub walked down the stairs. In the kitchen, no one touched anyone, and the woman in the blue jacket standing nearest to Delphine, the woman who hadn't spoken a single word during those 7 minutes, finally lowered her eyes to the document in her hand. The hearing opened on a Tuesday morning, and for the first 15 minutes, Everything unfolded exactly as Joe had calculated. Then Corinne's attorney rose and said that he requested permission to introduce new evidence concerning the integrity of the proceedings, and Joe felt something cold travel down the back of her neck before he had even finished the sentence. It was security camera footage. The waiting room of a medical clinic. A large man sitting in a plastic chair reading a magazine, day after day, without an appointment, without asking any questions. Then an ivory condolence card left on the reception counter, photographed, numbered, and formally authenticated. Then the sworn statement of the receptionist, who had counted exactly how many days he had been there and described precisely the way that man had smiled. "Your Honor," the attorney said, his voice sorrowful, like the voice of a man forced to say something he wished he didn't have to say. The opposing side's principal witness, Dr. Ansel Pryor, was intimidated for several consecutive days by an organized criminal operation. That is why he invoked his right to remain silent, and I don't blame him. And the woman seated there is currently living under the financial and legal protection of the very man who leads that organization. I'm not saying she is at fault. I'm saying that my client has been so frightened she hasn't been able to sleep, and now the court understands why. A murmur traveled through the courtroom like wind through leaves. Raphael Castellane sat in the back row without moving, and inside his chest, something was slowly sinking. 4 days. He had sent Emmett before he met her, before he knew her face, during those 4 days when he believed he was helping. He had lived for 15 years by that instinct, and it had never failed him. And now it had placed the finest weapon of his life directly into that woman's hands, carefully wrapped and personally delivered. He looked toward the plaintiff's table. Delphine sat with her back straight and didn't turn around, and inside his mind he heard again her flat voice in the snow. The sentence he had acknowledged with a nod, and then allowed to slip away, and he understood that she had been right from the very first minute, right in every word, and he had been the only person in the room who hadn't listened. Joe stood. She did the only thing left to her. She submitted what she had uncovered from the map. The telephone records from the night Delphine's father died, 3 calls from Auguste Marchetti Vance's phone to his daughters. None of them answered. Then a 4th call, 2 minutes later, to another telephone inside the same house, on the same floor, less than 20 paces away. That call connected. It lasted 40 seconds, and the emergency call wasn't made until 26 minutes later. The entire courtroom fell silent. Corinne's attorney rose almost immediately and said, very calmly, that his client had been in a state of panic, that she had run to find medication, that she hadn't understood how serious the situation was, that this was a wife who had just lost her husband, and the other side was attempting to turn her grief into an accusation, and, Your Honor, nothing on that page proved anything at all. And he was right. That was the terrible part. It proved nothing. There were 100 innocent explanations for 40 seconds and 26 minutes, and not one person in the world could prove which one was true. The judge recessed the hearing until the afternoon. In the hallway, Raphael Castellane stood against the paneled wall. He didn't strike anything, he didn't speak to anyone. He only stood there with both hands in the pockets of his coat, looking down at the floor. Delphine came out and found him there. She didn't ask him why. She didn't blame him with a single word. She stood beside him, resting her back against the same wall, looking straight down the empty hallway, and she said very quietly, "For 18 months I believed my father called to say goodbye to me. I comforted myself with that. I thought he only wanted to hear my voice one last time, and I was on stage playing Brahms, and that was all right, he would have understood." She swallowed. "Now I have to wonder whether he called because I was the person he trusted. 3 times, and I didn't answer. And the person he finally had to call instead of me, the person who was right downstairs, answered for 40 seconds. Raphael closed his eyes. "I'll never know," she said. "That is the last gift she gave me. Not the truth. The empty place where the truth should have been, and I'll carry it for the rest of my life." Then she turned toward him. "Are you listening to me now?" The hearing resumed that afternoon, and nothing changed, because an accusation like that didn't need to be true. It only needed to be spoken in a room where reporters were sitting. That evening, Raphael Castellane didn't go home. He sat in the second-floor office with his lawyer and said, "If the thing they're pointing at is the harbor, then take the harbor away." Joe thought he was joking. He wasn't. The first idea was to sell it. He rejected that immediately. Selling would mean Sarkeesian had to take possession of an asset already under scrutiny, and he wouldn't accept it, and even if he did, the harbor would still be the harbor, and people could still point at it. Raphael wanted something else. He wanted the harbor to cease existing in the form it had known for 40 years. So he did something no one in Providence had ever heard of. He transferred the entire warehouse operation into a publicly registered joint venture, with independent audits performed by a firm in Boston, reports filed on time, and a real governing board with real meeting minutes. Operational control went to the Sarkeesian side. Raphael retained a minority interest, with no voting rights, no seat, and no voice. It meant that from the day the agreement was signed, he would lose the power to decide what passed through that harbor. He would lose most of his income, and he would permanently lose the ability to use it for anything an auditor wasn't permitted to see. The harbor his father had built from 3 warehouses and a borrowed truck, the harbor that had fed Federal Hill for 40 years, would now become an ordinary, painfully dull, clean business, and it would no longer belong to him. Ghazar Sarkeesian read the draft twice. Then he set it down and looked at Raphael for a very long time, and for the first time in his life, Raphael saw that old man at a loss for words. "You're giving me control," he said, "and removing the risk." "Both at once." "Yes, no one does that." "Yes," Sarkeesian signed. He received what he wanted without paying a single cent in risk, and Washington no longer had anything to examine, because the only thing worth examining had stripped itself bare and stepped into the light. 3 days later, Corinne's attorney rose in court and spoke about a criminal organization, and Joe submitted the joint venture registration, the audit report, and the list of board members, and he continued for perhaps another minute before sitting down. The accusation was still there. It simply had nowhere left to stand. Emmett Straub came on the evening before the papers were signed. He didn't apologize. He had already apologized in the hallway that night, and they both knew it meant nothing. He only asked whether Raphael was serious, and Raphael said he was, after 10 years. No severance, no letter of recommendation, no telephone call made on his behalf. Emmett understood better than anyone what that meant in Providence. A Castellane man dismissed by Castellane himself would find no door in the city open to him again, not because people hated him, but because they wouldn't dare. He would have to leave. His wife, his 2 children, the house in Cranston. All of it. "Do you know what you've just done?" Emmett said. His voice was still calm. "That harbor was your father. It was everything you are. You've just handed it to an old Armenian man in exchange for 1 line in a report no one will bother reading." Raphael didn't answer. And then Emmett Straub, the man who had stood behind him for 10 years without raising his voice once, shouted. It was the only time. "You've just cut off your hand a second time." A long silence filled the room. Raphael Castellan drew his left hand from his coat pocket. He looked at it, the hand around which the entire city had spun dozens of stories, the hand he had hidden for 15 years and never explained to anyone. "The first time I cut it to pay a debt my father owed," he said. "I was 19, and I thought that was how a man preserved a name. I preserved it, for 15 years, and look at what that name did for her in court this morning." He lowered his hand. "This time, I'm cutting it so I won't owe anyone anything anymore. Go, Emmett Straub left. The door closed very softly, because even at the end, he still wasn't the kind of man who slammed doors. Delphine Marchetti Vance knew nothing about what happened that night. She wouldn't know for many weeks, and when she finally learned, it wouldn't come from him. Joe found it near dawn, not in the records themselves, but in their margins. The original petition had been filed, withdrawn, and then filed again, and in the first version, the one no one had bothered reading because it had been replaced, there were spaces for 3 signatures instead of 2. The third space had been crossed out. Beneath the line, a name could still be read. Harlan Vosk. He had retired immediately afterward and moved to Vermont, and it took Joe a day and a half to find him, and when she gave Raphael the address, she said, "Be careful. A man removes his name from a document like that because he's afraid, and frightened men don't open their doors." Harlan Vosk opened his door. He was 70 years old, wearing a sweater, still holding a cup of coffee, and he studied the tall man standing on his front steps for a long moment. Then he spoke, before Raphael even had the chance to introduce himself. "I've been waiting 14 months for someone to come and ask." His house had a fireplace, shelves filled with books, and an armchair permanently shaped by the body of a man who sat there every day. He poured more coffee. He didn't ask where Raphael had come from, what he did, or what he wanted. I met with her for 2 hours, Vosk said. 2 hours, Mr. Castellane. They handed me a thick file and told me I only needed to confirm the findings, that it was merely a formality, that my colleagues had already examined everything. I sat with her for 2 hours because that is how I had worked all my life. I didn't know any other way. We talked about her father, about managing an estate, about a book I was reading that she happened to have read as well, about music, of course. I asked because I was curious, not because it was in the file. He set down his cup. By the 20th minute, I knew. By the 90th, I understood what was happening to her and who was doing it. She told me. She spoke very calmly, very clearly. And that was what made it sound most like madness, do you understand? A person inventing a story stumbles over the words, but she spoke as though she were reading minutes from a meeting. I sat there thinking, dear God, this girl is being hunted. What did you do? Raphael asked. I withdrew my signature, he said it very softly. 4 days later, I called her attorney and told him I wouldn't sign, that I disagreed, that I wanted my name removed from the document. They were very polite. They thanked me. They said it was perfectly all right, because 2 signatures were sufficient under the law. The fire crackled. And that was everything I did. Raphael said nothing. I didn't call the court. I didn't write to anyone. I didn't look for her. I had the judge's name in the file. I had the telephone number for the state medical board. I had 40 years of practice behind me, and a name people still respected. I had everything I needed. I filed my retirement papers, sold my house, and came up here. He looked into the fire. I told myself I had done my part. I hadn't signed. I was clean. There I've said the exact word I used with myself, Mr. Castellane. Clean. And I remained clean for 14 months while that girl slept in a car in a supermarket parking lot. The old man turned to look at him and his eyes were dry. Do you know what the worst part is? I slept very well. I came up here, read my books, walked every morning, and slept very well for 14 months. I didn't spend a single night tossing and turning. That is what I can't forgive myself for. Not that I did nothing. That it was so easy. Raphael Castellane sat in silence for a long time. He had entered many rooms in search of guilty men, and he had found them, and never once had anyone opened the door and read aloud his own indictment before Raphael could ask the first question. When he stood to leave, Vosk walked him to the door. He remained there in the doorway with the Vermont wind blowing inside, and he said, almost to himself, there is one more thing. About her mother's instrument. Raphael stopped. The old man didn't continue. He only looked out toward the forest, and there was something in his face that made Raphael, a man who had spent his entire life asking questions, decide not to ask. Harlan Vosk appeared in court 10 days later. He didn't gain a single cent. He received no immunity. He took the stand and testified that he had spent 2 hours with Delphine Marchetti Vance and had known she was completely sane. And then he testified against himself as well, admitting that he had known, that he had remained silent, and that he had slept soundly. And in that courtroom, it wasn't money, cameras, or any elaborate scheme that brought Corinne Marchetti Vance down. It was the confession of a man who had nothing to lose and nothing to gain. Joe offered to take her to a hair salon. Delphine said no. She had cut her own hair with kitchen scissors on some night during that winter, and it was still uneven and jagged, and she said, I want them to see what 3 months inside a car does to a human being. If I walk in there with neatly styled hair, they'll think it couldn't have been that bad. She entered the courtroom that way. She wasn't rescued a second time. Raphael didn't stand beside her, and Joe didn't speak for her. She stood up and spoke for herself. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice even once. Her voice was low and clear, like someone reading a piece of music she had known by heart for years. Your Honor, the cruelest thing they did to me wasn't taking away my home. It wasn't my mother's instrument. It wasn't the name I had built in my profession, even though it took me 20 years to earn it. And the 3 months inside that car weren't the worst thing either, though I know that is what you will remember most when you leave this room. She allowed the silence to reach its deepest point. The worst thing was that for 14 months, there was someone patient, gentle, and full of concern who told me every day that my own mind couldn't be trusted. She didn't shout. She didn't strike me. She only spoke softly, a little each day, in front of other people, until I began recording conversations inside my own home. And I need you to understand why I made those recordings, because the opposing attorney will tell you that it was the behavior of a paranoid woman. I didn't record them to use against her. I recorded them to prove to myself that those conversations had truly happened. Because I could no longer trust my own memory, someone in the back row released a very quiet breath. I'm standing here to tell you that it didn't work. I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what happened and who did it. I ask only one thing of you. She lifted her head. Look at me. Truly look. Then decide for yourselves whether you are looking at a madwoman, or at a woman who was nearly robbed of everything, because someone calculated with great precision that no one would ever bother to look closely. Emmett Straub testified afterward no one had invited him. He came on his own, unemployed, wearing the only suit he owned, and he testified. He testified that he had been the one who called the opposing attorney. He testified that Rafael Castellan hadn't known, hadn't given the order, and had dismissed him that same night after 10 years. He testified about the waiting room and the condolence card, and said that he had done it before his employer had ever seen the woman's face. The accusation of organized crime, which had survived 2 hearings, collapsed in 40 minutes. When he stepped down from the witness stand, he didn't look toward Rafael. He only said to Joe, loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear, I can't undo what I did. I can only stand here and say it aloud. That is all I have. And then Corinne Marchetti Vance stood. Her attorney reached out to stop her, and she brushed his hand aside. 49 years old, dressed in a flawless gray coat, and in that moment something inside her broke in too, and what poured out wasn't a denial, before a ghost. She had been married once before, 3 years. She spoke only of the result, not of what he had done to her, and she didn't need to say it, because everyone in the room had just heard it described step by step throughout 3 hearings. During those 3 years, she had stopped trusting her own mind. She escaped. She told people. No one believed her. She had no lawyer, no doctor, no one tapping on her car window at 3 o'clock in the morning. She had no one at all. I learned how it worked. Her voice tore through the courtroom. Do you think I invented it? I survived it. I got out, and I looked around, and I saw that it worked, that it always worked, that no one ever stopped it. And I asked myself why in this world I had to be the one who suffered it, instead of the one who used it. No one spoke. The judge didn't strike the gavel. Delphine Marchetti Vance stood. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke so softly that everyone had to hold their breath to hear her. Then you knew exactly what it was. You knew what it did to a person from the inside, one day at a time. You stood in the exact place where I'm standing now. She looked directly at the woman. And you did it anyway. You aren't evil because you didn't understand, Mom. You are evil because you understood perfectly. The temporary order was lifted that same afternoon. The petition for permanent guardianship was denied. The trust was released. The house in Newport, the house that an uncontested will had left to her 18 months earlier, was returned to her through a document less than a page long. Joe handed her the key on the courthouse steps, and Delphine held it and stared at it for a long time as though it belonged to a stranger. She went home the following morning, 94 days. She stood outside the gate for a while before walking in, and Raphael remained 3 steps behind her and said nothing, because he had learned that there were certain thresholds people had to cross alone. Inside, everything was new. That was the first thing that struck her. There was no dust, no cobwebs, none of the abandoned decay she had imagined throughout that entire winter in the car. The house was spotless and warm and completely unfamiliar. A new sofa, new curtains, paintings she had never seen hanging where the pictures she had grown up with used to be. Her grandmother's dinnerware was gone from the glass cabinet, and now the cabinet held beautiful crystal glasses from which no one had ever drunk. She walked through each room. She didn't touch anything. She passed through the kitchen, through the dining room, up the stairs, and along the upstairs hallway where a 9-year-old child had once stood looking at the backs of adults. Then she opened the door to the music room. It too had been renovated. The floor had been polished. There was a beautiful standing lamp, and in the corner by the window, in the exact place where her mother's cello had stood for 20 years, on the wooden stand her father had built with his own hands, there was now a cream-upholstered armchair. It was beautiful. It suited the room. Delphine Marchetti Vance stood in the doorway and looked at that armchair for a very long time. Then she said, very softly, to the empty room, "I'm home, Mother," and that was when she collapsed. Not in court, where she had stood with her back straight and spoken in a low, clear voice before an entire panel. Not in the car, where she had survived 94 days without letting anyone see her cry. Not in Joe's kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, with a wooden spoon in her hand. Here. In her own room when she was safe, when there was nothing left to fight. Because trauma knows how to wait. It waits until a person is finally allowed, and not 1 second sooner. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the polished wooden floor and wept with a sound no one in her life had ever heard. Not the crying of an adult, but the crying of a child left outside a closed door for 18 years. Raphael Castellane didn't help her stand. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He walked inside, sat down on the floor beside her with his back against the wall, and stayed there. For a very long time. Sunlight moved across the floor and changed color, and he was still sitting there. Several weeks later, the prosecutor called. Corinne Marchetti Vance was facing charges serious enough to take away the rest of her life, and they asked Delphine what she wanted, because in cases like this, the victim's voice carried weight. Delphine sat in the kitchen of her own home, in her father's house, and signed a statement asking for leniency. Joe nearly overturned the table. "Do you understand what she did to you?" "I understand it better than you do," Delphine said. Then she explained, and she explained only once. In the courtroom that day, she had heard that woman scream that she had once stood in the exact place where Delphine was standing, that she had survived it, that she had looked around and seen that it worked, and then she had made a choice. And Delphine understood that at that very moment, sitting in this kitchen with a pen in her hand, she was standing in that same place, at that same crossroads, holding that same power. "If I destroy her," she said, "then I become her. That isn't something I'm saying because it sounds noble. It's real. I just watched it happen to a human being right in front of me." She pushed the paper across the table. "I'm not forgiving her. I'm forgiving myself." Raphael stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the paper, then at her. "Do you know what people in my world call that? Weakness," she said. "I was going to say," he replied, "the thing I've forgotten how to do." 3 weeks later, Joe came to Newport carrying a file no one had asked her to bring. She placed it on the kitchen table and said, "I'm violating attorney-client privilege by giving this to you. And I don't care." It was the joint venture registration, the independent audit, the list of board members without his name on it. Delphine read very slowly, and she was the daughter of an estate manager. She understood documents, and she understood what she was holding before she reached the 3rd page. That harbor was everything his father had left him. He hadn't sold it. He had done something far worse for a man in his world. He had stripped it bare and placed it permanently beneath the light, handed the power of decision to someone else, and retained only the portion that gave him no right to say a single word. He had done it during the same week an attorney stood in a courtroom, pointed at him, and called her a woman kept by a criminal leader. Delphine sat motionless for a very long time. Then she asked, "Did he know I would ask?" "He knew you would never accept it if you knew beforehand," Joe said. "So he finished it first and only then allowed you to find out. And he will never tell you, Delphine. Never. I'm the one telling you." Then Joe took out a second document, and her voice changed. "And this. I think you should hear it from me." The instrument in the corner wasn't her mother's. Marguerite Vance's cello had been sold at that charity auction, and within a month it had left the United States for the collection of someone on the other side of the world, and it would never return. Harlan Vosk had arrived too late. He had tried. He had called, written letters, and arrived too late. So he had done the only thing a coward could think to do. He sold his house in Vermont. He used the money to search everywhere for a cello from the same period, made by the same workshop, from the same kind of wood, as close to the original as anything in the world could be. Then he brought it back to the house he rented and kept it there for 14 months. He didn't dare send it. He didn't dare call. In the file was a sentence he had spoken to Raphael in the doorway that day, which Raphael had written down for Joe. "I know it can't replace anything. I simply didn't know what else to do with my cowardice," and Raphael Castellane had gone to retrieve it, and he had placed it in the corner of a room filled with morning sunlight, and he had done so before anyone knew whether her hand would ever be able to play again. That evening, Delphine sat down with that instrument inside her father's house. She played. It was bad. The ring finger of her left hand curled inward of its own accord on the 4th note, and the musical phrase broke in two, and she began again, and it broke again. She played the entire piece. "It isn't my mother's cello," she said. "It's mine. Perhaps that is what I needed more, in April." At the Providence harbor, the wind had grown warm and the water was no longer the color of lead. Raphael removed the watch from his wrist and placed it on the iron railing with the glass turned toward the sky, and Delphine saw him do it and understood that he was about to say something very difficult, and she decided not to make him speak first. Tomorrow I'm going back to Newport, to my house. Because of you, she looked out across the water, and I've discovered that I don't want to go. He didn't turn around. You have to go. It's your home, I know. You aren't the kind of man who keeps anyone from leaving. That is precisely the problem, Raphael. That is the whole problem. She turned toward him. So I have to be the one who says it, because you never will. I'm not giving you my hand out of gratitude. Gratitude can be repaid with a letter, and I write very good letters. I'm telling you that in my entire life, the only place where I have ever felt truly safe, truly seen, and truly myself is beside you. And I don't want to return to Newport alone, because I have discovered, quite unexpectedly, that a house isn't a home. Home is you. Raphael Castellane drew his left hand from his pocket. He didn't hide it. He raised it between them in the April sunlight for the first time in 15 years. I was 19, he said. My father died owing a debt of honor, and I paid it in the only way people accepted then. I thought it was the price of carrying a name. I've lived for 15 years believing that was all I was worth. Something that could be cut away and given to someone else as payment. He looked at her. I went to that parking lot, intending only to correct one wrong, and then return to my silence, because silence was the most I ever dared hope for. And instead, I found someone who looked at this hand and didn't pull hers away. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence. Yes, I don't deserve it, but yes, they were married in Newport that summer, in the garden behind her father's house, and Ottilie Brennan Ward was the one who walked the bride down the grassy path, because Delphine wouldn't allow anyone else to do it. The old woman cried harder than anyone else there that day. She began crying the moment she stepped outside, and continued through the entire ceremony, and Delphine had to stop halfway down the path to hand her a handkerchief, and the whole garden burst into laughter, and Mrs. Tilly laughed with them even as she kept crying. Then, that fall, the house opened its doors. Delphine named it Marguerite House after her mother. It was a tuition-free music school for any child who wanted to learn music, but had no one who could pay for it. There were no auditions. There were no applications. All they had to do was come. One June afternoon, 2 years later, the windows of the music room stood wide open to the garden, and sunlight poured across the floor, and 8 children were rehearsing together, and they were playing terribly. Wrong notes, broken rhythms. One child came in an entire measure too early. Another burst out laughing in the middle of the piece, and then the whole group began laughing, and no one could keep playing. Delphine leaned against the doorframe, laughing with them. Her fingers still wouldn't obey her. She would never play the way she once had, and she had learned how to live with that, and on that afternoon it didn't matter at all. A little girl raised her hand. Miss, I played it wrong. I know, Delphine said. I heard it. The little girl blinked. Are you angry with me? And Delphine Marchetti Vance crossed the room and sat down, lowering herself until she was at the child's eye level, and she said, No, I believe you. You said you played it wrong, and I believe you. That is how it works here. When you tell us something, we believe you. Now let's play it again. Raphael Castellane stood outside the door and looked in. Carved by hand into that wooden door, without gold leaf or ornament, there was only one small sentence that every child could read. Here, when you speak, someone will believe you. He never returned to his silence. She never allowed him to. And this story leaves us with something very simple, and also very difficult. Throughout everything that happened, no one ever raised a hand. The stepmother only spoke softly. The closest friend only offered one kind piece of advice. The woman carrying coffee simply went to work. The old doctor merely withdrew his name and then slept soundly. An entire city simply did nothing, and because of that, one woman nearly lost her whole life. The greatest evil in this world rarely shouts. It is often very polite, very gentle, and it only needs us to turn our faces away at exactly the right moment. But this story also teaches us the opposite. One man asked a stranger to look closely, and she looked, and everything changed. One emergency worker asked the right question. One young doctor was willing to sit quietly and truly look at a photograph. One 71-year-old woman finally knocked on a door. She came late, but she came. Believing another person when they speak is the least costly thing we can give one another, and also the most precious. And in the end, remember that not everything we lose can be recovered. Some fingers will never play the way they once did, Some questions will never receive an answer. But people still go on living, still go on loving, still open the windows and let the sunlight in. And that is the truest courage of a human life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that each day you can hear more compelling stories like this one. How did the story of Delphine and Raphael make you feel? What do you think was the cruelest thing anyone did to her? And have you ever been the person who was willing to look closely? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what is deepest in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, joy in every day of your life, and abundant peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.